The courtroom fell silent as an 8-year-old boy rose, clutching a worn legal pad and calmly declared, "I'd like to speak for my mom." What followed astonished even the judge. The room wasn't full, but a palpable shift occurred the instant Jalen Morris stood. He was 8, perhaps 8.5, slender, with close-cropped brown hair and a backpack still slung over one shoulder, as if he'd just arrived from school. His feet dangled above the floor as he sat beside his mother at the defense table, a tattered legal pad resting on his lap, its pages folded and creased from countless readings. Judge Denise Weller had just called the case Morris versus Nance, and inquired if the assigned public defender was present. Silence hung heavy. After an uncomfortable pause, the judge sighed, glancing at Tiana Morris, rigid beside her son. "No representation today?" the judge asked, her voice tinged with frustration. Tiana's lips parted but no sound emerged. Her hands gripped her knees so tightly her knuckles blanched. She'd held on all morning, but now it felt as if the ground had vanished beneath her. That's when Jalen stood. "Excuse me," he said, his voice quiet but clear. "Can I say something for my mom?" The room hushed, not with polite attention, but with a bewildered quiet, as if people doubted what they were witnessing. Judge Weller blinked, caught off guard. "Young man, this isn't really. I just want to say a few things," Jalen added, one hand still on his backpack strap. "She didn't do anything wrong, but nobody's here to help her. I've read everything. I know what's going on." A beat passed, then a soft scoff emanated from the landlord's attorney, Brent Coulson, who whispered something to his client. A bailiff shifted. A quiet chuckle rippled through the gallery. Jalen didn't waver. "I brought notes," he said, pulling the legal pad up and flipping it open with a practiced gesture. "They said we could get help, but nobody came. I think I can say it the right way now." Judge Weller sat straighter. "You want to represent your mother?" "I just want to help her. Just for today. I know I'm not a lawyer." The judge paused, lips pursed, hands resting on the bench. She surveyed the courtroom, reporters scribbling, lawyers whispering, murmurs rippling. She sighed. "Approach the bench, please," she said. "Just you." Jalen walked forward, his small sneakers squeaking on the polished tile. He looked up at the judge, not with fear but with unwavering purpose. Judge Weller leaned in. "You understand this isn't a game, right?" "Yes, ma'am." "You understand this is a legal hearing about whether your mother gets to stay in her home?" "Yes, ma'am. And I've read about the Fair Housing Act and how they gave her notice wrong. They posted it too soon after the complaint. We have proof." There was something about "we have proof" that made Judge Weller lean back in her chair. Not smug, not dramatic, just certain, like a child who knew what he'd witnessed and wouldn't tolerate a lie. "You may proceed," she finally said. And just like that, Jalen Morris became his mother's voice in a court of law. He turned back to the room, walked to the center, and stood beside his mother's chair. Then he began, "On March 12th, my mom told Mr. Nance about the mold in the bathroom. She took pictures. She even wrote a letter and sent it by email. He didn't fix anything. Then 2 weeks later we got a paper saying we were being evicted for damage to the unit. But we didn't cause the damage, it was already there." He flipped to another page. "Florida Statute 83.56 says a landlord has to give written notice in 7 days to fix the problem. But we didn't get a warning. We got a threat." Chairs creaked as people leaned forward. Brent Coulson scribbled. The judge watched, her expression unreadable. Jalen continued, clear and deliberate, as if he'd practiced this speech a dozen times or whispered it to himself before bed. "My mom works 2 jobs. She doesn't have time to fight people. But she asked for help and nobody helped. So I watched videos. I read what I could. I think the law says we should get a chance." He paused, looking at the judge. "Am I allowed to object if something they say isn't true?" That's when the courtroom finally broke, not into laughter but audible gasps of shock. Even a paralegal whispered, "Oh my God." Judge Weller's lips twitched slightly, almost a smile but not quite. "You may continue," she said quietly. But before Jalen could utter another word, the room needed to understand how things had reached this point. Tiana Morris hadn't imagined she'd stand before a judge with her child, praying someone would see her as more than a case number. Born in Gulfport, Mississippi, and largely raised by her grandmother after her parents split, Tiana learned early how to keep things together. She earned her CNA license by 20, moved to Pensacola a few years later, and had Jalen at 24. Life hadn't given her much, but she made it work. Just her and her boy in a 2-bedroom apartment on West Avery Street, not far from the hospital where she worked the overnight shift. Those who knew Tiana wouldn't describe her as loud or proud. She wasn't one to raise her voice or seek attention. But she possessed a quiet pride, proud that Jalen had never missed a day of school, that he always had clean clothes and knew how to say yes ma'am and thank you, proud that she'd never asked for anything she hadn't tried to earn first. They lived modestly. Her days off were spent doing laundry, picking up extra shifts, or watching reruns with Jalen. No grand vacations, no shopping sprees. Yet she always ensured Jalen had books, sharpened pencils and lunch money, even if she skipped her own lunch to make it happen. Then last winter, everything began to unravel. It started with a burst pipe under the kitchen sink. Maintenance arrived a week later, barely looked and promised to return. They never did. Soon mold crept behind the cabinets. The bathroom ceiling leaked when it rained and Jalen began coughing at night. Tiana sent photos, wrote emails, filed complaints, but nothing changed. The apartment wasn't just deteriorating, it was turning against them. The landlord, Gregory Nance, stopped returning her calls. When she finally reached him, he told her she was too difficult, and perhaps this wasn't the right place for her anymore. That's when she knew he wanted her out. Tiana had no savings, barely keeping up with rent. But she had proof. Photos, messages, every date meticulously recorded in a cheap spiral notebook she kept in the kitchen drawer. She filed a complaint with the city, but while that processed, Nance made the first move. An eviction notice appeared taped to her front door on a Tuesday morning. Jalen saw it first, staring at the paper, silent. Tiana snatched it, skimmed it, and sank onto the arm of the couch as if someone had punched her. "We didn't do anything," Jalen said softly. She couldn't answer. She contacted legal aid, waited 3 weeks for a response. They assigned her a public defender. A young man who seemed kind but overwhelmed. Tiana spoke to him once on the phone. He told her eviction court was swift. "Don't worry too much, bring what you have, someone will be there." She wasn't reassured, but she didn't know what else to do. Meanwhile, Jalen was observing. Every night he watched her at the dining table, trying to decipher the lease, Googling legal terms on her cracked phone. She thought he was just coloring or doing homework at the other end of the table, but he was listening, always listening. She'd find scribbled notes in his notebooks, words like statute, tenant rights, mold clause. She said nothing, assuming it was his way of understanding. Kids notice more than we think. But she never imagined what he was truly doing. She had no idea he was studying. The night before court, she barely slept. She laid out Jalen's school clothes, packed his lunch, figuring the case would be postponed or the lawyer would finally appear. She hadn't wanted to bring Jalen to the courthouse, but her neighbor canceled last minute and she couldn't miss the hearing. So she brought him. They sat side by side in the courtroom as minutes crawled. Tiana tried to appear calm, but her hands were slick with sweat. When the judge called her name and no one else stood, she thought, "This is it. I'm alone." And then, before she could move, Jalen stood beside her. But things hadn't simply worsened overnight. Their apartment on West Avery Street had been deteriorating long before eviction was even a thought. They'd moved in 3 years prior. It wasn't perfect. Neutral carpet, chipped baseboards, noisy plumbing. Nothing Tiana hadn't seen before. It was all she could afford, and the location was convenient. Close to Jalen's school, close to Sacred Hope Medical Center where she worked the graveyard shift. At first, the landlord, Gregory Nance, had been professional enough. Not warm, not friendly, but he answered the phone and fixed what was needed. That changed after the second year. Minor issues escalated. The refrigerator developed a loud ticking sound that kept Jalen awake. The back bedroom window wouldn't close completely. The water heater acted up every few weeks. When Tiana called, she got voicemail. When she emailed, no response. When she visited the management office in person, a new assistant told her Mr. Nance was busy this week. So she started documenting everything. She kept a dated paper log of every call, every unanswered email. She saved photos on her phone. She even took a video of the leaky ceiling over the tub, where water dripped steadily from a crack in the plaster. Jalen would shower while she stood guard with a mop nearby. One night, the toilet backed up and flooded the bathroom. It took 5 hours for someone to respond. The next day, the drywall near the baseboards was already peeling. Jalen was coughing more by then, especially at night. Tiana worried it was the mold. She tried cleaning it with vinegar and baking soda, unable to afford anything stronger, but it persisted. Black streaks around the tub behind the fridge in the closet near Jalen's shoes. Still, she paid rent on time every month. She wouldn't give Nance an excuse to claim she was late. The final straw came after she quietly filed a complaint with the Pensacola Housing Code Enforcement Office. She didn't announce it, didn't confront him, she simply followed protocol. That's when Nance's demeanor shifted completely. He stopped returning calls altogether. Days later, a notice appeared on her door, alleging she'd violated lease terms due to excessive damage to property. She stood outside, paper in hand, staring. Jalen was at school. She didn't know whether to scream or cry, she just felt insignificant. She'd done everything correctly, yet this man held the power to seize the only home her son had ever known. When she tried calling the office again, no answer. Email, no reply. A week later, she received an official eviction letter. Jalen saw her crying that night. He didn't speak at first, just sat across from her at the table while she stared at the letter. Then he slid his math book aside and met her gaze. Are we gonna be okay? She offered a toothless smile. Of course we are. You're lying, he said, not with anger but with certainty. She laughed a little. I'm trying not to. He nodded, then pulled his notebook closer. I don't think he's allowed to do this. I read that they have to give you a chance to fix things first. She blinked. You read what? I was just looking online. I saw a video about renters' rights. It said something about how they have to send you a letter before eviction and give you time to fix whatever they're mad about. She didn't know what to say. That night, long after he was asleep, she picked up his notebook and flipped through the pages. They weren't schoolwork but observations. Quotes from websites, references to laws, 7-day notice required by statute, no retaliation for reporting issues, mold is health hazard. Her son had been studying law. She should have told him to stop, to let her handle it. But a part of her felt something shift. Jalen had always been sharp. He grasped things quickly, spoke clearly, asked insightful questions. But this was different. She didn't know it yet, but he was preparing. Preparing for the moment someone would try to silence them. Preparing to speak up when she no longer had the strength. But before that moment came, the legal system would reveal just how little it cared for those falling through its cracks. The day the official eviction notice arrived, it wasn't the paper that terrified Tiana. It was the quiet. No knock, no doorbell, just a sheet taped at eye level flapping slightly in the wind. She found it coming home from her overnight shift, the sun already high, sweat gathering under her scrubs. Jalen was at school. Her keys dropped before she even realized she'd let go. She pulled the notice from the door and read it once, then again. Legal terms, deadlines, court date, violation of lease due to tenant-caused damage. No mention of her complaints, the mold, the broken sink, the ignored maintenance logs. She slid down onto the front steps, elbows on her knees. She was exhausted, not the kind of tired sleep fixes but something heavier. She tried calling the housing office. The person who answered said, "We can't offer legal advice." She hung up before she cried. That afternoon she made 5 more calls, left 5 more voicemails. Then she sat at the kitchen table, pulled out her notebook and flipped to the next clean page. Date, time, eviction notice received. No prior written warning. She circled that last part 3 times. Jalen came home to the smell of microwave pizza and the sound of her typing. He dropped his backpack and walked straight to the table. They gave us the paper, didn't they? She paused. Yeah. He sat beside her, pulling out his own folder of papers. They can't just kick us out. She reached over and rubbed his back. We're not going anywhere. But he didn't believe that, and neither did she. Over the next week things moved swiftly. She was assigned a public defender, Brian Quintero, who worked out of a satellite office behind a DMV near Brent Lane. He called her 3 days before the hearing, his voice clipped and distracted. I've got your paperwork. You'll need to bring everything to court. Lease, photos, complaints, anything you have documented. Will you be there? She asked. Should be, but in case I'm tied up with another hearing, just tell the judge you're waiting on counsel. They'll understand. She hung up, feeling like she was already losing. She gathered everything, printed emails, time-stamped photos, maintenance logs, even the mold swabs she'd taken with Jalen's science kit. Everything went into a plastic file folder. She labeled each tab in black marker. Jalen watched from the other end of the table, flipping through his own notes. "They're gonna try to say it's your fault," he said calmly. "I know. Do you have the lease?" "Yes." "Did you highlight where it talks about repairs?" She looked up. "Jalen, baby, you don't have to. I just want to make sure." She sighed, then slid the lease across to him. He flipped to the middle, ran his finger down the page. "Right here, section 5. It says the landlord has to maintain a habitable residence, including running water, plumbing, and protection from mold or mildew. That means they were supposed to fix it." She smiled in spite of herself. "You really read all this?" He shrugged. "I couldn't sleep. They spent that night organizing." Jalen made sticky notes for each photo. He arranged the papers by date. When Tiana asked why he was doing all this, he just said, "You need help. I'm here." She kissed his forehead. "You're my little lawyer now." He grinned. "Call me junior attorney." The morning of the hearing, Tiana dressed in her best outfit: black slacks, a navy blouse, flats. Jalen wore his school uniform, khakis and a white polo, his shoes polished, hair freshly brushed. They took the bus downtown, neither speaking much. Inside the courthouse, it smelled of floor cleaner and paperwork. People shuffled in and out of rooms with tired eyes and folders clutched to their chests. Some alone, some in pairs, some with babies in strollers. Courtroom 2B was nearly full when they entered. They found a seat near the front. Tiana didn't want attention, but not in the back either. She wanted the judge to see her, hear her. She didn't know it yet, but that spotlight was about to shift. The clerk read names. People shuffled forward, their cases taking minutes, sometimes seconds. A man in a neon orange hoodie walked out, visibly upset. A young woman with a baby on her hips sobbed as the judge delivered a ruling. It was fast, unforgiving, like a machine grinding through names. Jalen sat still, eyes moving. He watched every lawyer, every word, every pause. Then came the words, Morris versus Nance. Tiana stood, heart hammering. She looked to the side, expecting to see her court-appointed lawyer slip in at the last second. He wasn't there. Judge Weller glanced around. "Representation for Ms. Morris?" No response. Tiana opened her mouth, tried to say, "He's supposed to be here," but nothing came out. Her voice caught in her throat. Jalen stood before she could. "Your Honor," he said, stepping forward, his legal pad tucked close. "Can I say something for my mom?" The judge blinked. "Excuse me. I want to speak on her behalf just today." Tiana reached for him. "Jalen, baby, sit down." He didn't. The bailiff looked confused. The clerk looked amused. A few quiet chuckles rippled through the room. The landlord's attorney, Brent Colson, smirked and leaned toward his client, whispering something no one else heard. Jalen didn't move. He just looked at the judge as if this were normal, as if kids did this all the time. "I've read everything," he said calmly. "I understand the timeline. I know what she's being accused of. I think I can explain what really happened." Judge Weller folded her hands. "How old are you?" 8. "But I'm almost 9. That drew a louder laugh from somewhere in the back. Jalen didn't blink. "Your Honor," he continued, "we don't have anyone else. My mom didn't do anything wrong. She asked for help. Nobody came. I just want to say what I know." The judge leaned back slowly, scanning the room. Then, to everyone's surprise, she said, "Approach the bench." Jalen stepped forward, sneakers quiet on the tile. He stood straight, eyes level with the top of the desk. He bent forward, voice low. "Do you know what a hearing is?" "Yes, ma'am. I know this is real. I'm not pretending." "And what would you say if I let you speak?" "I'd start with the dates, then the pictures, then the lease terms. Then I'd talk about the repairs that never happened." Judge Weller looked at him for a long time. Then, to everyone's surprise, she said, "Go ahead." Jalen turned, walked back to where his mom stood frozen, and positioned himself next to her. He looked at the judge. "My name is Jalen Morris," he said, projecting louder now. "I'm here to speak for my mom because nobody else showed up to do it." He opened the legal pad. On March 12th, she emailed the property office about the mold in our kitchen. On March 14th, they replied saying they'd send someone. No one came. On March 20th, the leak got worse. I recorded a video of the water coming through the ceiling. We still have it on our phone. He flipped the page. Then on March 27th, we got a notice saying we were being evicted because we caused the damage. But that's not true. We told them before it got bad. We have proof. His voice didn't shake, he didn't rush. He sounded more like a junior attorney than a scared child. His mom stood beside him, jaw slack. Jalen continued, referencing specific clauses in the lease agreement and even citing Florida Statute 83.51, which requires landlords to maintain a livable property. He pointed out how the timeline of events didn't align, how the landlord failed to act, and how the notice was issued in retaliation. When Brent Coulson objected, Judge Weller raised a hand. Let him finish. Jalen looked at her and asked, "Am I allowed to object if something they say isn't true?" A hush fell across the courtroom, not mockery, not disbelief, just silence, pure stillness. Felt like everyone forgot to breathe. Judge Weller let out a slow exhale. "Yes," she said softly. "You may continue." But what Jalen said next would shift more than just the court's mood. It would change the entire tone of the case. Jalen didn't pace. He didn't wave his arms or dramatize anything. He stood still, one hand gripping the edge of the legal pad while the other flipped each page carefully, like the way his teacher told him to handle library books. Every sentence he spoke sounded like he had already said it 10 times in his head before opening his mouth. He continued, "My mom didn't get the 7-day notice the lease talks about. They just gave her the eviction. We didn't get time to fix anything even though she asked. I wrote down everything in the order it happened." Judge Weller leaned forward slightly, elbow on her bench, her finger tapping her chin. She wasn't just listening, she was analyzing. The courtroom had gone completely quiet. Even Brent Coulson had stopped taking notes. The only sound was Jalen turning his next page. "There's also a law about mold," Jalen said, looking up. "I wrote it down here. It says landlords have to make sure the unit is safe and that they can't retaliate if you complain. But my mom did report it and we have the emails." He held up a printout, photos taped to the back of a grocery store receipt. The time stamps were still visible. Mold around the bathtub, water pooling in the ceiling, a close-up of Jalen's shoes with green spots on the sole. Coulson finally stood, smoothing the front of his jacket. "Your Honor, with all due respect, this child is..." But before he could finish, Jalen said, "That's the man who said we broke the apartment but we didn't. It was already like that. He never fixed it." Coulson raised an eyebrow. "Your Honor, I'd like to remind the court this is an informal presentation, there is no sworn testimony and..." "Mr. Coulson," Judge Weller cut in, "you'll get your turn." Coulson sat down slowly. Jalen returned to his notes. "My mom doesn't yell at people. She doesn't fight. She just works. Sometimes she works all night and still makes me pancakes before school. She called the number in the lease 3 times. Nobody ever came. I remember because she wrote the date on the calendar. I still have it in my room." He paused there, not because he forgot but because he felt something heavy behind his words. "She cried when she got that letter. I heard her. She never cries." Tiana looked down at her hands, eyes glassy. Jalen took a breath. "I think if we had a lawyer he would have said this better. But nobody came, so I had to do it. Because she didn't do anything wrong. She just wanted someone to fix the mold and they're trying to kick us out." He closed the legal pad. That was it. No grand ending, no mic drop. Just a little boy standing in a courtroom trying to stop his world from collapsing. Judge Weller didn't speak right away. She looked at Tiana, who had said nothing during the entire hearing, then at Coulson, who looked more annoyed than confident now, then back at Jalen, who stood as if awaiting instructions. "Do you have the documents you mentioned?" she asked him. Jalen nodded and handed over a small, neatly labeled folder. He had separated each section with handwritten tabs: emails, lease, photos, notes. She took it without comment. The room stayed still for a moment longer before Judge Weller cleared her throat. "I'm calling a recess. We'll reconvene in 30 minutes. The gavel tapped once as she stood to leave. Judge Weller said nothing to the bailiff, nothing to the lawyers, just one thing to Jalen as she passed the defense table. "You were heard." Jalen looked at his mom, unsure of what that meant, but Tiana's hand reached for his, gripping it tightly. Outside the courtroom, people were whispering. A reporter near the door scribbled notes furiously. Someone from the gallery was already on the phone. Jalen didn't notice any of it. He just reached into his backpack and pulled out a peanut butter sandwich. "I'm hungry," he said, his voice flat as if nothing unusual had just happened. Tiana laughed for the first time in days. But as they waited for the judge to return, they had no idea the outside world was already reacting to what had just happened inside that room. By the time they stepped back into the courtroom, the energy had shifted subtly. A man from the gallery gave Tiana a respectful nod. Another woman whispered to her seatmate, eyes locked on Jalen as if he were someone already seen on the news. The clerk re-entered and called the court back into session. Judge Weller returned to the bench with a small stack of papers, Jalen's folder among them. She adjusted her glasses, glanced at both parties and addressed the room. I've reviewed the materials submitted by the Morris family. I've also taken note of the defendant's absence of counsel this morning and the effort made to proceed regardless. She didn't smile, but her tone had softened. Mr. Coulson, do you have anything to submit before we continue? Coulson stood visibly flustered. Your Honor, while I acknowledge the child's effort, I must emphasize that this is an eviction case based on physical damage to the property. Whether or not repairs were delayed, the photographs suggest an environment that violates basic housing conditions. Conditions that, according to my client, were exacerbated by neglect. Do you have dated maintenance records? The judge asked. Coulson hesitated. Not at this time, no. Warning letters? He cleared his throat. No, Your Honor. Judge Weller flipped through the folder again. Then I will consider the timeline presented by the Morris family as credible, especially given the landlord's failure to respond to formal complaints prior to filing the eviction. That was it. No fanfare, no dramatic speech, just logic, facts, evidence. Coulson sat down without a word. Then came a brief rustling, papers shifting, shoes scuffing, muffled coughs. Jalen sat perfectly still. He didn't look at the judge. He looked at his mother, whose hands were now folded in her lap, clenched so tightly her fingernails left marks in her skin. Judge Weller continued, due to the lack of sufficient documentation from the plaintiff, the court finds no grounds to support the claim of tenant-caused damage. The eviction notice is hereby dismissed. It took a full second before the room reacted. Not everyone clapped, but enough did. Two women in the gallery let out soft cheers. One man gave a quiet whistle. A deputy near the door raised his eyebrows. Jalen didn't move. Tiana put a hand over her mouth and whispered, "We won." He nodded. "You did." Judge Weller looked directly at Jalen. "Mr. Morris," Jalen looked up. "I don't believe I've ever had someone your age speak in this courtroom the way you did today. That took courage and preparation. You should be proud." He nodded again, still calm, still composed, but his hand reached under the table and grabbed his mom's. He didn't let go. After court adjourned, things moved quickly. Strangers approached them with questions, others offering handshakes, even a young woman from a local nonprofit asking for their contact info. Jalen seemed overwhelmed but polite, his mouth pressed into a thin line as he answered every, "How old are you? And where'd you learn all that?" with the same quiet response. "I just paid attention." Tiana, still processing everything, barely noticed the man holding a camera outside the courthouse. "Can we get a quick interview?" he asked, "just a few words." Jalen hesitated. Tiana started to decline, but Jalen said, "Okay." The reporter crouched slightly to get on his level. "What made you decide to speak for your mom today?" Jalen looked at his mother first, then back at the reporter. "Because nobody else was going to." That clip aired on the 6 o'clock news within hours. It hit social media. By the next morning, #Jalen Morris was trending on Twitter. Local news turned national. National turned global. Suddenly, lawyers offered to represent them pro bono. Community organizers reached out. Housing advocates began quoting Jalen's line in rallies and articles. Nobody else was going to. He didn't care about any of it. All he wanted was to go home, sit on the couch and eat dinner with his mom without wondering if someone was going to knock and tell them to leave. But outside their apartment door, a much bigger conversation was just beginning, and Jalen's name was now part of it. In the days that followed, what happened inside Courtroom 2B didn't stay confined to Florida. It ignited a fuse. Local news outlets first picked up the story, showing a grainy clip of Jalen's closing line. "She didn't do anything wrong. She just didn't have a lawyer. But I'm here." That 30 seconds was enough. Within 48 hours, national networks were running it on repeat. Morning shows, legal podcasts, op-ed columns. Everyone wanted to discuss the little boy who stood up in court and overturned an entire eviction case. But while the world reacted with awe, something else also occurred. People began questioning why this had to happen in the first place. Why had a mother with a legitimate complaint been dismissed for months? Why was her case given to a public defender juggling dozens of files with no time to read hers? Why did it take an 8-year-old to capture a judge's attention? These weren't just questions. They were quiet accusations at first, then louder. By the end of the week, the Pensacola Legal Aid Office was inundated with angry emails from viewers nationwide. Some were sympathetic, others furious. How could you let her stand there alone? Do you even read your client's files? One local representative called for an audit into eviction handling procedures in low-income housing. Gregory Nance, the landlord, suddenly found himself in an unwelcome spotlight. His name graced headlines and his voicemail overflowed with angry messages. A few tenants from other properties came forward with similar stories. Ignored repairs, notices distributed instead of solutions. One woman posted photos of her bathroom ceiling, nearly identical to those Jalen had shown in court. The judge's ruling didn't establish new law, but it set a precedent. People were no longer just scrutinizing Tiana's case. They were examining a system. Jalen and his mother remained mostly private. They declined most interviews. Tiana disliked being on camera and Jalen wasn't interested in going viral. "I'm not a lawyer," he told one reporter. "I just didn't want us to lose our home." That simple truth resonated more than any headline. Behind the scenes, change began to stir. A local attorney named Melinda Charles offered full representation for Tiana. She reviewed the lease, the complaint history, and even walked through their apartment herself. "This isn't a one-time thing," she told them after that visit. "What happened to you is happening all over this city." Tiana nodded. "But most people don't have a Jalen." Melinda helped them submit formal complaints to the housing board and filed a motion requesting damages for breach of contract and emotional distress. The paperwork alone took 2 weeks, but for once Tiana didn't have to bear it all herself. Jalen sat quietly in the background through most of it, observing again just like before, except this time people were observing him. School was strange for a while. Teachers congratulated him. Other kids asked if he'd be on TV again. One student made a stinging joke about Jalen, pretending to be grown. He didn't respond, he just returned to writing in his notebook. He hadn't done it for attention. He'd done it because he didn't want to see his mother silenced. And even though they'd won that first hearing, he knew the system hadn't miraculously fixed itself. People were still being evicted, families still ignored, landlords still choosing threats over repairs. What he did created a crack in the wall, but the wall remained. Still, cracks let light in. A week later, Tiana received a call from a regional housing advocate asking if she would speak at a panel for tenant rights reform. She hesitated. "I'm not really that type of person," she said. "I don't like microphones." But Jalen asked her to say yes. "You don't have to be the loudest," he told her. "You just have to be the one who shows up." So she agreed. They sat together at the event, Tiana clutching her notes, Jalen in a clean white polo, the same kind he wore in court. She didn't say much, just told her story. What it felt like to be ignored, what it meant to be heard, and what it meant to have your child intervene when no one else would. When she finished, the room rose to applaud. She wasn't accustomed to that, but she smiled anyway. But even as the applause faded, one more question lingered. What comes next for a boy who defended his mother better than most lawyers ever could? The noise eventually subsided. Headlines faded. Hashtags stopped trending. Jalen Morris was no longer the boy in the courtroom, at least not in the public eye. But for those who knew him, for those who lived in that worn-down apartment on West Avery Street, nothing truly returned to normal. And that was fine. A few weeks after the hearing, their mailbox contained something new. A thin letter from the landlord's attorney. No eviction notice, just a formal statement that the property owner, Gregory Nance, would not pursue further legal action and that the Morris family was free to remain until their lease expired. It read coldly, but the message was clear. They had retreated. But staying wasn't what Tiana desired anymore. The fight had changed her. Not just the hearing, but the way her son had looked at her throughout it all, as if he knew she was worth defending even when she doubted it herself. That kind of clarity doesn't leave you untouched. So she called Melinda Charles, the attorney who had helped them post-trial, and asked for advice on applying for rental assistance and housing relocation programs. Melinda connected her with a local program that worked with hospital staff, offering subsidized rent for essential workers. They moved 2 months later to a small 2-bedroom on Coral Hill Lane. New paint, working locks. A dryer that didn't require 2 kicks to start. Jalen got his own desk. Tiana got a bathtub that didn't leak. In their old apartment, someone else moved in, probably another family with stories, probably another mother trying to juggle everything with a smile. Tiana didn't look back. Jalen started 5th grade that fall. Nothing about him outwardly appeared different, yet everything about him was. He wasn't louder, wasn't showier. He was still the same child who raised his hand when he had something to say, but now people listened when he spoke. At school, one of his teachers invited a guest from a local legal nonprofit to speak about tenant rights. Jalen listened quietly from the back, then approached afterward and thanked the man for explaining things so clearly. The guest blinked when Jalen introduced himself. "Wait, you're that Jalen?" Jalen just smiled and said, "Yeah, but I like math more." A few nights later, while Tiana was finishing dishes, Jalen stood in the kitchen doorway holding his folder, the same one he'd used in court. "Can I throw this out now?" he asked. She wiped her hands and walked over, flipping through the folder slowly. She saw his notes again, the tabs, the quotes, the dates in his small, neat handwriting. She paused at one page, the words, "Nobody else was going to," underlined twice. She didn't answer right away. "Keep it," she finally said. "Not because we need it anymore, but because one day when someone else needs help, you'll remember what you're capable of." Jalen nodded and tucked it back into his backpack. Later that evening they sat on the couch, dinner plates cleared, cartoons playing softly. Jalen leaned against her, legs pulled up, and asked a question she hadn't expected. "Do you think I could ever be a lawyer?" She turned to look at him. "You already were one," she said. "You just didn't get paid." He laughed. He laughed too. And that was the first time in a long time that things felt light. Not perfect, but lighter. The experience hadn't made them rich. It hadn't brought justice to every other family fighting a similar battle. But it gave them something real. Dignity, the kind that can't be bestowed by a system, a judge, or a trending headline. The kind that comes from knowing you stood your ground and told the truth. Jalen didn't need the world's applause. He just needed a place where he and his mom could sit in peace, with the front door locked and no one trying to take it from them. And he got that in the end. The lesson wasn't just about law or housing or courtrooms. It was about love, about showing up when it truly matters, about being small in a room full of adults and choosing to speak anyway, and about remembering that silence only triumphs when no one dares to break it. So, the next time someone tells you a child can't comprehend what's happening, think of Jalen Morris. Because when everyone else remained quiet, he raised his hand and changed everything.